We are so excited to welcome M0 and Predicate. We love doing joint interviews. This will be fun. You guys can hear us? Love it. Okay. Well, we'll try to keep this orderly in terms of how we ask questions because we're not we want to do more of these types of panels. Why don't we start with each of your intros, and then we'd love to talk about some of the news that you guys have together. Joao, it's good to see you again. Familiar face of the show. Why don't you start?
Hey, thanks for having me again. I wanna know if I'm at the top speakers.
You're getting there.
You're tied with Ben
Rags.
from
I think Rags
right now.
has the throne. Raghuveera has the throne.
Rags can have the throne. That's fine. No, for those who don't know me, I'm Chief Strategy Officer at M0. Spent a lot of time in stablecoin land. Used to work at Circle prior to M0. Built USDC, and at M0 now we're trying to bring this idea of a modular stablecoin infrastructure to market.
Awesome. Thanks for joining, Nikhil.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here. I've been looking at your guys' podcast for a little bit, so this is pretty awesome. So I'm Nikhil, co-founder and CEO of Predicate. Prior to this, have a background in digital asset policy, also spent a lot of time at Celo, where I led most of the major deployments on the Celo blockchain. And at Predicate, what we build is on-chain compliance infrastructure for a number of different crypto native organizations. We've been working closely with M0 for some time, so excited to have some of this be public. We build on-chain compliance infrastructure. We're tackling a lot of those questions around like AML, CFT compliance in the digital asset space.
This is a hot topic lately, with everything going with Tether freezing some funds today, Circle making some decisions not to freeze funds. Help bring us into more of the relationship between M0 and Predicate. Joao, I know on our last conversation, we dove into more of the role M0 plays as the infrastructure, obviously working with issuers, but not always being the issuer. Where do you sit in the stack with Predicate, and how does that even influence other stablecoins being issued on M0, like USDKY, I think just came out this week. And I think each week I see a new M0 stablecoin as well. So help us understand the benefit there.
Cool. Yeah. So I can kick it off maybe, and then Joe, you can talk about how that relates to everything else. So what we've built with M0 is a mechanism for your various different M extensions to have automated compliance settings. So as you guys mentioned, right, like Tether or Circle have to think about what to freeze, what not to freeze. We know at a baseline that you have to enforce sanctions requirements, right? All stablecoins have to be able to do that. And so we built infrastructure where we can support, and we support many M extensions on essentially having that and making that programmatic. Right. So the idea here is that this should really be seamless. This shouldn't be something that you need a large compliance team to be able to do some of these baseline configurations and requirements. And it's how can you make that automated, embedded into an M extension to be able to support all these different organizations as they launch M extensions. So this really starts with those aspects of how do you actually have automated freezing, essentially, for sanction addresses. And then from there, it's as you have some of these other custom stablecoins, you get into a world of how do I set proactive screening and proactive requirements. So that way, if something like, how do you avoid my assets interfacing with, a major exploit or those kinds of things. But again, it's where we really sit as we plug into the M0 infrastructure and ensure and support all M extensions on having these types of like baseline AML configurations that they need.
Yeah, it's fun. And actually, Nikhil and I go way back. Right? We met at USDC time, and when Nikhil did a great job convincing me to bring USDC to Celo at the time. But we have been working with the Predicate team for a while now, right? So I think it's actually a pretty cool piece of solution that we give our clients. Just zooming out a bit, the view of the world that we have is that we believe in this world where stablecoins are going to be infrastructure for builders, for fintechs, and infrastructure should in general be modular, right? It's typically something that people deem as like a good attribute of infrastructure. So what we have done over the last few years at M0 is to literally unbundle what it means to be a stablecoin, and then kind of re-architecting that in such a way that every major concern around the build out of a stablecoin could be modularized, right? So you can have like multiple solutions on the issuance layer if you build on M0. You can have multiple solutions on the liquidity layer if you build on M0. And obviously one of the important layers or components in the entire solution is compliance, right? So how do you handle the various like requirements and needs that you have, which are going to be different for every one of these instruments, right? Because it depends on the use case they're leveraging. It depends on the jurisdiction they're in, the requirements they're going to have from a regulatory, from a policy point of view. And so we at M0, we're not that opinionated on that, also because, it's going to vary from use case to use case. So the way that we work with Predicate and Nikhil and the team over time is how do we integrate what Predicate does, because they have a pretty neat like solution for that into the M0 modules. And effectively what we give our builders is a ready out of the box integration, right? That says, if you want compliance and if you want to configure it your own way, we have these hooks like in the templates for the stablecoins or the M0 extensions, as Nikhil said, that already call out to Predicate, right? Already integrate to Predicate and deliver for you like all these screenings or compliance checks or sanction checks, whatever the requirements are. And so this is one more example of how when you modularize the infrastructure and when you make it specialized, right, prone to specialization, like Predicate is the specialists, they are the experts in this area. There's no reason why the builders shouldn't work with them for this particular module on the stack. Then.
That's amazing. Go ahead, Zach.
You take it, Drew. I had the first one.
I wanted to just dive specifically into this morning's news around the Predicate Asset Compliance and what you guys specifically announced today. We have the blog up, we have some of the tweet up. Maybe Nikhil, if you want, I can pull this up as we chat, but I'd love to just dive into like what some of these controls actually mean, what specifically happened today, and then we can dive into a little bit of this. I think the framing here would be for new M extensions or existing M extensions that are thinking about rolling this out or excited to roll this out, kind of a working session for them on what they need to know, what this unlocks, things like that.
Yeah, so taking a step back, I mean, what we built here is a mechanism in which we plug into the asset contract as an M extension to ensure you have automated and programmable types of freezing activities that you need. So for example, for sanctions or other types of cases. And so this is not why we're announcing it today. It's actually already live and in production by multiple folks, including, for example, consensus for MUSD. We just hadn't announced it. And so the great part here is we don't like to do an announcement that's not real. So it is something that's live in production at scale. But the main premise here, right, is that as Joao was talking about, is that when you have a stablecoin, you really have to navigate how do you ensure and meet various compliance requirements when you have an M extension. And some of those involve sanctions, but it's not always only sanctions. It's really how do I avoid interfacing with terrorist financing, human trafficking, child sexual exploitation material. Like there's a whole number of different things you have to account for. And this isn't always cut and dry for every group. And so there is some baseline standards that everyone would usually have. But then you get into a world of like other configurations that one might need. And an example of that is, there's a major exploit that happens, such as like drift. And so you could say that a stablecoin issuer might say, a stablecoin project might say, look, we actually don't want our assets to be touching the addresses involved in that. And so they can either go and do these types of manual executions that will just take time. And it's not the best place that an organization should really be operating in the space, especially given the speed of digital assets. And so what we've built is a programmable infrastructure. And so it plugs in directly into the M extension. And so that way, any M extension group actually has a full platform that they access through. So a full front end system. They can see what assets have been frozen, why it was frozen. They can set configurations and say, okay, great. I have my baseline configurations. They can bring in data from external providers. We work closely with folks like TRM and Blockade and others. So you have a unified compliance layer that directly plugs into the asset contract. And all this is our view that the beauty of blockchains and digital assets is that programmability, right? Like that's really something that we haven't fully leveraged. And when it comes to compliance, like we can actually do a lot of that. And then the last part I'll mention is obviously for us, we spend a lot of time working with regulators. And so in this case, we can actually think about what are the pieces that different builders might need and anticipate that. So as they're operating in different jurisdictions, they're focusing on different markets, they have different types of customers or partners, whether that's a fintech or a US financial institution, they can say, okay, great, I have all the configurations I need here to be able to go and scale and sell and acquire users.
So how much is that agentic? Like I'm thinking through the example of, we had Mac Brennan from Project Zero on Tuesday. They were one of Drift's largest integrations. They obviously, kind of like what you said, they got the alert and it was a foot race to shut this down.
It sounded pretty manual based on how he described it. Like it was a fairly manual process, and he was proud of how fast they dealt with it, but it didn't seem like a programmatic.
So that's what I'm wondering, like, is this a flag where you set these parameters where if something happens with this address, then there's an agentic workflow that turns this on? Or is there, like, how much of that is still, it's manual, but it's easier, quicker? I guess I'm just trying to understand the distinction there in this very practical scenario.
Yeah. Let's go through this. So let's first talk about the manual flow. So if you talk to many legacy financial institutions or legacy asset issuers, they usually have a bit of a manual flow here as well, where, the compliance team hears about something or sees something. And what they then need to do is they need to say, okay, great, I need to raise a ticket that goes to our engineering team. An engineer has to work on it and then go and execute a freeze. As you can imagine, that will take at minimum a few hours. If not, we've seen it happen, take days. So there's that is like a manual case. But to your question then around like, is this agentic? Is this automated? How does this work? The real question is just how do you make that determination of it is if it is something you should be executing a freeze or some type of restriction of. And that can be based off of lots of different data tools. And so this could be blockchain analytics providers. This could be, internal data from that organization. For us, really, it comes down to, I think the agentic part, it's not quite there yet because AI is usually used to triage what you should be kind of flagging as high risk. But really at the end of the day, the decision of are you freezing it or not, it's a whole host of analytics data, clustering, and then some components of AI as well. But you really want to have a very good view around what is the case of this data, and then it gets automatically executed, right? So all of this is executed in real time. It's really just on the backend system, what types of data are being pulled in.
If I can add something, I think a lot of what I see the evolution of these crypto systems, particularly with stablecoins in the last few years already, I think it's actually the realization that we never had like great tools for building fintechs on top of this infrastructure in the same way that traditional fintech has had, right? Because I've worked in like a couple of fintech solutions in the past, and when it comes to risk and not so much, I won't even mention like the sanctions and some of the compliance checks, but even for things like general risk, right? Let's say you're building a fintech, there's a lot of stuff that there's a very mature market out there for assisting fintech builders with things like, is this email address risky or not, right? Should I block a sign up based on this email address or not? Is this phone number risky or not? Is this address, this IP address? Like there are so many things that fintech builders over time figure that, they are data points that like contribute to some overall picture of risk for whatever it is that you're doing, if it is an onboarding process, a transaction, etc. And we don't have that for crypto. Predicate is one of the leading companies in that space, but in general, we don't have that vision in crypto. What ends up happening is that everybody who builds an app, everybody who builds an app on top of stablecoin or even build their own stablecoin, they redo all this stuff from the ground up. And it's insane. Like this just like slows everybody down like so much. For example, then in the fintech world, if there is an exploit, if there is an attack, if somebody steals a credit card number from somebody, there are vendors that say, there's a block list now, and this credit card number has been added there, or this email address has been added as, violated. And then, all these hundreds of fintechs who use those service providers, like stop using or increase the risk associated with that entity, right? Again, we don't have this in crypto. Everybody is like monitoring sanctions lists and all these things manually and doing that at their own speed, usually not fast enough, usually through a manual process. I think the benefit of a more structured approach, like having, a company like Predicate be specialized in this being done in a programmable way that it can bind to stable assets and then have M0 deploy this as a template that's ready, a template integration that's ready to go for people, is that when Predicate, and this is configurable, right? Like people can work with Predicate and say, I want this policy, but I don't want this other one. This doesn't apply to me. But when one of these things happen, it can be, the reaction can be so much more effective, right? Because like if their systems make a decision that certain entities or an address, for example, is not deemed kosher, all of a sudden, everybody who uses Predicate is like compliant from that second on, right? And this is super powerful and it saves so much time for all these builders.
A question for you, Joao. Just we were kind of joking about this, which I don't know if that's the best way to cover stories like what happened with Tether and some of the stuff with Circle, but we've just been looking at some of this stuff. And for you specifically, Joao, given your background and some of the news that we're seeing with drift, freezes, I think what it looks like from our perspective are systems that haven't been built like this, systems that don't have these types of kind of pre-configured compliance and automated systems built in. Can you speak a little bit about like just thoughts on what's going on when it comes to the freezing and some of the current state of things as it relates to the issuers that are more traditionally architected, maybe the differences there with M0 and what's now unlocked here? I'd love to kind of compare and contrast a little bit here.
Yeah, I will preface by saying that unfortunately this is a very complicated topic. I think I sympathize with everybody who is defending like all sides of this argument, right? Someone have done something, should they not have done something? I think there's genuine reasons on all sides for or the approaches that have been taken. I mean, on the one end of the spectrum, you could say that, the correct principle is if you can do something, then you should do something. I think that it's hard to argue from a moral stance that, that's not the right approach. However, unfortunately, we live in like a world of litigation and lawsuits and legal conflicts, and there are slippery slopes that if companies start doing what they think is right, sometimes they will make a mistake and they will do things with the right intention, but actually on the wrong principles. And then they will create like significant amount of liability for them. I'm not saying, this is the case for this particular, the drift hack or this other vulnerability. I think it's, as I said, unfortunately, it's too complicated, but I kind of sympathize that it's not an easy problem for stablecoin issuers or stablecoin builders to address. I think the correct answer here is actually on policy, is actually on legislation. I think hopefully with rulemaking on Genius, I think it will become more clear what the actual threshold, what the actual bar is. And Nikhil, for folks who are in the industry and who understand this space, Nikhil used the word like threshold, or sometimes people say red lines, right? People usually know that, like, for example, OFAC sanctions is like a red line. There are like, personal criminal liabilities. You don't play with that. Like, you don't touch a sanctioned address because you're going to get in trouble if you do that. There are other things that are more from a risk threshold point of view, right? Do you want to interact with this wallet? Yes or no? It's kind of a risk decision. This part around like hacks, this is not well defined. Like, what is that, right? It's usually more something in the realm of law enforcement and supporting law enforcement and stop these bad characters, recoup some of these funds. Like, that's what you actually want to solve for. And I don't think we have clear guidance on how stablecoin issuers should act. I think with Genius, we will see more guidance, and then hopefully it will become more clear what should be done, what shouldn't be done.
Yeah, I can add to this as well. Reason why I'm wearing a suit is I was just in the Treasury's office meeting with them, with Treasury, OFAC, and FinCEN, precisely around what Joao was talking around regulation. Yeah, I think it's not clear, right? I think if you're an issuer, and you're caught in one of these awkward situations where it's like, hey, like we see that our asset is being held by a malicious actor, but we as an asset issuer don't have a lawful order. It's very difficult for you to say, oh, I'm going to go and execute a freeze. Do you really want to do that? Because at the end of the day, it's a property seizure, and you have to have some very strong legal position to say, oh, we have this position to say we can revoke access of your property. And I think that's the big nuance, is right now that's really not there. And so if you do it incorrectly, you're liable to be sued from users. And so this is actually one thing that I know Treasury's been thinking about, and I believe it was also in the White House digital asset report, is how can you, as an issuer, have some type of either safe harbor or some type of capability as to say, we have the respective ability to say, we need to pause and address for a period of time so we can investigate and make sure and inform law enforcement, rather than facing potential legal implications. But right now, it's not really been defined. And so as a result, you'll have issuers that will be hesitant to take action, right? Because they don't have that legal capability to do so. And it is a massive legal risk. These are the kinds of challenges that Circle and Tether and others are really facing.
Yeah, it's so complex. I'm imagining that those types of configurations or customizations to those rules are things that, extension partners like Cast, who might be using or working with M0 in this way, they can go in, work with their compliance risk security team, define what those standards are within the Predicate system. Is that a correct understanding of it?
That's exactly right. And I think the beauty of this too is regulation evolves, and none of this is also static. The organization and their business requirements also changes over time too, like as Cast scales or as consensus scales on the MUSD. And so the other thing we've thought a lot about is when you've integrated Predicate, then you don't have to make any new custom smart contract updates or really any types of technical changes. You're actually able to update your entire policy configuration whenever you need to as a compliance team. And that's really important, right? Because these things are real time. The world evolves, and especially in this industry, it changes dramatically every 6 months or so. And so it's really, in this case, that this is all tied to growth, right? That none of this world is static. Really, what we're trying to do is make sure that blockchains become the global financial settlement system, and stablecoins are intimately and intricately tied to that possibility. And so because of that, you have to have that ability to evolve over time.
This little philosophical here. I know, Joao, I think in our last few conversations and some of them with Drew, you like to kind of go down that rabbit hole. And I think, was there a mistake when these ecosystems or Ethereum was first architected where this should have been in place, and maybe where Predicate should have been, integrated at the like I said, at the layer 0 foundational level, or was it better to kind of start here at this maybe overly permissionless, decentralized nature to where now people can come in and build systems on top of it? I was even just thinking of this kind of is like this full circle moment where we've said, wow, a lot of us get into this space for the decentralized nature, permissionless, anybody can build, anybody can issue their own stablecoin now. And we're saying, actually, hold on, we need to dial it back. If we truly want finance to come on chain, we need to have these safeguards in place. And we're seeing this blend of what do we want from the old system and what do we want from the new system, and how do they kind of play nice together, and what does that blend look like? Where do you see this going? Because I see M0, you're really sitting at the intersection of this, where we want companies like CAS that are the neobanks of the future issuing their stable coins. We want anybody else to be able to go issue a stable coin, but we also want them to do it the right way.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, actually. And I do think, I wouldn't say there was a mistake, but I do think we got very confused, I think, as an industry, because I think there's a very clear distinction in my mind. And now I think looking back, we understand the role that a lot of these components in crypto play, right? So there is a role clearly for like a permissionless and open blockchain solution, right? Blockchain substrate. And associated with that, usually there is a role for like a native asset, a native token associated with that. So, Ethereum, ETH, Bitcoin, BTC, et cetera, et cetera. That is a very, very foundational base layer that needs to exist. It needs to be really decentralized. It needs to be like really open and permissionless, because there is a need, there's a need at that foundation, in the same way that, when you peel all the onion of the layers of the internet, like at the base layer, there needs to be like a good foundation of, similarly, decentralization, permissionless, like the same thing applies to the internet. Because if you don't have that, if let's say the internet was owned by a company, let's say, the base layer was owned by a given company, it would prevent a lot of things from being built in a sustainable way on top of that. However, so I think that most people, I think, would agree with that we want ETH to be like fully permissionless, fully decentralized. It cannot be taken away from your wallet, like in no way, right? However, whatever you built on top of that, then a lot of people thought that by definition, it should inherit the same properties. And I think that's very questionable, right? Particularly with real world assets. I think a lot of what we talk about in crypto, when we talk about crypto today, is like centralized asset issuer using that substrate to build something on top of it. But it's a centralized asset issuer, like, damn well, like, who is the company behind something. And, they are using blockchain ledgers because they're more efficient, they're global, yada, 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 all the things that we know that are good. But they are still that one company that And a lot of people, I think, got confused and thought that, their asset also needs to be permissionless and decentralized or pseudo-decentralized. And that means that they can basically wash their hands and not really do certain things that they would be required to do were they building on more traditional rails, on more centralized rails. I think that's the mistake. I mean, at the end of the day, if something happens with the stablecoin, for example, with the fiat collateralized stablecoin, I'm talking about like the centralized model, right? If something happens with the on-chain version of that, and I'll tell an anecdote. The issuer ultimately is the entity that will decide whether that's the correct outcome or not. So back in the day, a few years ago, when Ethereum was going through an upgrade, there was chatter in the industry pointing out that, yes, we can debate whether the final Ethereum chain is going to be this, this version of the fork or that version of the fork. But actually, what is Circle's opinion? Because if Circle says that they're going to honor USDC redemptions on this chain and not on that chain, you bet that that's the chain that people are going to use, right? So there's some things that you just cannot hide from, right? Like the association and the power that these centralized asset issuers have is different, and it's not permissionless and it's not decentralized, and people shouldn't pretend that it is, right? So to say that, no, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't take back funds, because we live in a permissionless and decentralized world. Where? Well, at what layer of the stack, right? At the base layer of the stack, yes, we want that to be the case. We want that to be the foundation. But for centralized asset issuers for real world assets, that's not the case. The issuer ultimately will decide what's the right outcome for an asset. They will rewrite the ledger if they want to, right? That's always a prerogative, even at a regulatory level. So we shouldn't pretend that that's not the case.
It's awesome. Guys, any other like key takeaways or final statements around the announcement, what you're excited about in terms of this relationship. It sounds like this relationship is one that you guys personally have had for a long time. Actually, the integration and product relationship is something that has already existed. Any like final takeaways or things you'd want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll note is, I mean, I think the great part of M0 and how all of this is made possible, right, is because of the way they've designed their infrastructure that really, and it goes to, I think, Joao's point around that base layer neutrality, but then you're building financial products on top of a blockchain, and M0 provides the rails for that. And that expressivity, that control, the nuances and differences between one M extension versus another are really important. And I think that's what makes M0 so powerful on what you can do with it. And then for us, of course, from a compliance standpoint, it makes a really, really natural fit because we also see that nuance, right, across different organizations. And this is where I think Joao and I first talked about Predicate and M0. This was like maybe like 2 years ago. And this was like when we were earlier days, they were also earlier days too. But it was, again, this view that people are going to be building financial products on blockchains, and stablecoins are core to that. And M0's capability on what makes that possible is really, really powerful as a result.
Yeah,
I guess last quick like granular
go on.
question. Is this something like, if I'm on the cast side, what user experience am I actually doing this? Am I in like an M0 dashboard and these things are embedded white labeled, or am I doing this in Predicate's dashboard? Or is that flexible in terms of how it works now?
So if you're a cast stablecoin user, you wouldn't actually realize any of this. The only people that would actually be the cast organization that's defining these configurations, and that would be done on the Predicate platform. So the process is like M0 has someone who's coming up as an M extension. They basically connect us. We onboard them onto our platform. We give them access. We have secure access to all of that. We create a Slack channel with them, and then
great.
Let's set this up.
Cool. Just wanted to clarify that. Joao?
No, I think, as Nikhil said, like we have been ideating on this for a long time, and the product is live. The integration has been worked on for a while now. I think now we're at a point, and that's why I agree with Nikhil, like we should always announce these things when they're actually meaningful and robust. Now we're at a point, right, Nikhil, where we're actually scaling, right? So we have MetaMask and a couple of other teams like operating with this solution already, having their stablecoin built on M0 and having the compliance and sanctions checks and other verifications like powered by Predicate. Now we're at a point where at M0, as part of our go-to-market motion, when we have a new client, we always hand them over to Predicate. We always hand them over to Nikhil and the team and recommend this as a solution for their screening and compliance and risk activities. There are some cases where honestly, we even mandate it. We even highly suggest that people utilize their solution because the feedback that we get is great. Like, when people realize that they have this option and they don't need, this is another concern that they can check off their list and not really have to build anything about it, people get super excited about it.
Awesome. Well, cool, guys. Thank you for taking the time. It's awesome to be able to host and go into partnership announcements like this. Just, for each of you, as more of these really interesting things come to life in your own businesses, we'd love to be a part of going a level deeper. I think as we think about why this show exists and the service of the industry that we want it to have is to really help serve as like making things make sense for people. And announcements like this are really great to see. And thank you for giving us the time to dive into it.
Nikhil, look out for some key quote tweets today with some clips on top of your announcement. Really think of that's like the nice pairing. There's news going out. We want to help co-create content that supplements that news and provides that context.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you so much.